In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Smart UV Projection. This is the automatic version of UV unwrapping. Basically, how Smart UV projects work is that they can create invisible seams to try and unwrap your objects as best as Blender possibly can. So instead of you manually marking seams, you can simply select your entire object and you can select Smart UV Project, and it will create seams in places that it deems feasible to create a decent UV map. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of Smart UV projection in Blender. So we're going to go into our UV editing mode, and we're going to do a few of the primitive meshes just to see what happens, what's the main difference. So I'm going to start with the cube, so I'm going to go tab into edit mode, everything's selected, U, unwrap. So as we know by now, when we unwrap a cube, we have all 6 faces unwrapped, but they are all the same size and they are all on top of each other. Now if we go Smart UV Project, we get a series of 3 separate options. We have angle limit, island margin and area weight. I'm going to first and foremost show you what happens when each of these are normal. So I'm going to click OK. And fantastic, so we can now see that we have all 6 faces equally distributed across the UV map. And that's very good. So we can even select islands. But there's a thing here, because these 3 are connected based on where the seams are. We can't see the seams on our mesh because we didn't create the seams. Blender automatically created the seams, and it seems to have created seams along these 3 faces to allow for decent separation. But as a result of this, these 3 faces are now connected. So I'm going to undo that. Make sure we undo that numerous times. Now I'm going to try again Smart UV Project, but the one I want us to focus on is the island margin. Let's have a look at what happens if we increase the island margin to 2. So it only goes up to 1. So we can go anywhere between 0 and 1. So let's see what happens at 1. So that's very interesting. So now all of our faces have been disconnected because we've told Blender that when it projects our UV map, that each island must have a certain amount of space between it and any other islands. So now, as a result of that, Blender has had to remark the seams so that every single face is disconnected. This is brilliant because now we can select islands, we can move them about, we can resize them however much we want, etc. Let's have a look at a couple more examples of Smart UV projection, and we're just going to worry about the primitive meshes for now. So I'm going to go into object mode and just move that to the side. Doesn't really matter, we don't need to delete it. Let's try a UV sphere. So let's unwrap this UV sphere. Once again, we can see very, very interesting how it's covered the entire UV map, but we really can't tell what's what. We have absolutely no idea here. This is a very poor unwrap. So let's do a better one. Let's Smart UV Project. So let's press U, Smart UV Project. I'm going to bring this back down to 0, so we're going to show 0 and 1. Just so you know, for this lecture, we're not really going to worry about angle limits or area weights, at least not for now, because although they're useful, they're not very necessary for creating what we want. So, okay. So, we now have a series of islands. 6. Fantastic. Now let's try and see what happens if we increase the distance between them. So Control Z, U, Smart UV Project, increase to 1, OK. So basically, in the case of the UV sphere, the shape of the maps is pretty much exactly the same, but they're just smaller so that we've created more space between them. In this scenario, that's not really ideal. Actually, to be honest, it would be better to Smart UV Project in this scenario, because they're all still disconnected, so you can grab one and move it about, no worries, and they take up pretty much the whole of this UV map. And ideally, that's what you want. You want your project to be organized, to be able to select any part of the project you want, but you also want it to fill up your UV map. And we're going to learn about why that is when we go into creating checkerboard textures. So let's now try one more. We're going to see what happens when we do Suzanne the monkey. So let's have a look at Suzanne the monkey, and let's see how Blender unwraps Suzanne. So we're going to go into edit mode, U, unwrap. So that's not horrible. We've got the eyes here and we've got the head here, but it still looks quite messy in certain places. So that's not the worst one I've ever seen, but we can make that better. So we're going to go U, Smart UV Project, OK. So a much more complex object such as Suzanne result in a lot more seams being created, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot. So we now have an absolute ton of islands that we can work with, and this may look a bit daunting, but don't forget that you can always sync selection so that you can know exactly what face represents what part of your object. So it's not too bad. The only problem in this scenario would be the fact that if you were to export it to, say, GIMP, you would have to come back a lot to your Blender screen just to double check what face is what part of the object, because that's an awful lot to remember by memory. So I've done a lot of clicks, so I'm going to do a lot of undos now, and we can pretty much tell what we're going to do next. And there's just a little bit of a problem. There we go. So if you do just a little hint here, if you do sync your two views together, remember that you have to unsync it before you can get rid of your UV map, just as a little bit of advice there. So finally, we're going to go U, Smart UV Project, up that to 1, and basically we can tell what's going to happen here, can't we? Basically, what we expect to happen is for it to unwrap in the same way, just as our UV sphere did, but all of the islands are going to be a lot smaller. So press OK, and they are a lot smaller, a lot smaller. We have to zoom in a lot here. Now this looks sorry, this looks very good actually, because it looks like we can really focus on specific faces without worrying about any others. The only problem here is that because these are all so small, the texture for every single one of these is going to be tremendously stretched. If we click on stretch, and we're just going to select all of these, we can see coming in that there's a lot of different shades of blue in quite a lot of them. So there we've got lighter blue here, light blue here, light blue here. It's actually not as bad as I expected it to be, but that's because they're split up into so many different islands that stretching occurs across multiple faces in a very small space. The fortunate thing about this scenario is, yes, these islands are accompanying a very, very small space, but none of the islands have too many faces in them. So it's not too bad. But there we go, guys. That is the art of smart UV projection in Blender.